The old elevator in the Ravenswood Manor apartments groaned its way up to the 4th floor, a sound as familiar to Sarah Gable as her own heartbeat. It was the soundtrack to her life, a grinding, metallic sigh that had accompanied her 5 days a week for the last 3 years. She was the property manager for this historic Chicago landmark, a 12-story behemoth of Gilded Age architecture that had been meticulously maintained, all polished brass, intricate crown molding, and marble floors that echoed with the ghosts of a wealthier past. Sarah knew every creak in the parquet flooring, every temperamental radiator, and every one of the building's 68 residents by name. Well, almost every one. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her blazer, a sharp intrusion into the elevator's weary song. She pulled it out, seeing the number for the front desk. Gable, she answered, her voice crisp and professional. Ms. Gable, it's Ben at the front desk. Sorry to bother you, but Mrs. Henderson from 6B is on the line again. She says the, smell is back. Says it's worse now. Sarah suppressed a sigh, pinching the bridge of her nose. The smell. For the past 2 weeks, it had been the building's newest and most perplexing mystery. It wasn't a garbage smell, or a dead rodent smell. It was something else entirely, a cloying, sweet sickly odor, like rotting honey and damp earth, that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the 4th floor hallway. Tell her I'm on the 4th floor now, Ben. I'll look into it. Again. The elevator doors slid open with a final, shuddering clunk, and the smell hit her like a physical blow. It was indeed stronger today, thick enough to feel at the back of her throat. The 4th floor hallway was, as always, immaculate and silent. The rich, dark walnut wainscoting gleamed under the soft glow of the sconce lights, and the Persian runner muffled her footsteps. But the air was wrong. It was heavy, oppressive, and tainted with that inexplicable sweet decay. Her first stop, as always, was the least problematic. Apartment 4B. The file was thin, almost laughably so. A lease signed over 20 years ago by a Mr. Arthur P. Lemarchand. Rent was paid in cash, always left in a plain white envelope in the dedicated mail slot by the 1st of the month. No phone number on file. No email. The only correspondence was a single, typewritten note added to the file a decade ago. Under no circumstances is maintenance or any building staff to enter this unit. All is well. And for 20 years, all had been well. No complaints, no requests, no noise. 4B was a black hole in her otherwise meticulously managed universe. She stood before the door, a heavy, ornate piece of oak with a polished brass number. There were no smells coming from under this door, no strange sounds. It was just a door. Yet, it always made the fine hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She reached out, almost unconsciously, and placed her palm flat against the dark wood. It was cold. Unnaturally so, a deep chill that seeped into her skin despite the building's more than adequate heating. She pulled her hand back as if burned, shaking her head at her own foolishness. Get a grip, Sarah, she muttered to herself, turning away from the unsettling silence of 4B. The source of the smell had to be elsewhere. She spent the next 20 minutes on her hands and knees, inspecting the baseboards for any signs of a dead animal, checking the air vents, and even sniffing at the other apartment doors, 4A, 4C, 4D. Their residents were normal, concerned people who had also complained about the odor. It was everywhere and nowhere all at once. Frustrated, she decided to check the building's original blueprints, stored digitally on her office computer. Maybe there was a forgotten utility chase or a blocked chimney flue. As she stood up, her knee brushed against the baseboard near the end of the hallway. To her surprise, the dark wood was damp. She looked closer. It wasn't water. It was a slow, viscous seepage of a black, tar-like fluid oozing from a hairline crack where the wall met the floor. It was thick and slow, like cold molasses. And the smell was strongest right here. This was new. This was a problem. She pulled out her phone and took a picture, her mind already racing through the list of plumbers and contractors she would need to call. This was going to be a massive, invasive repair. As the camera flash illuminated the gloomy hallway, something else caught her eye. She leaned in closer, her breath catching in her throat. The black fluid wasn't just pooling. As it seeped out, it wasn't spreading randomly. For a fraction of a second, in the shimmer of the fluid, she could have sworn it coalesced into a pattern, a series of intricate, interlocking spirals, before dissolving back into a formless puddle. She stared, frozen, for a full minute, but it just looked like black goo. She had to be seeing things. The stress, the weird smell, it was getting to her. She took a deep breath to steady herself, immediately regretting it as the sickly sweet air filled her lungs. This was no longer just a nuisance. Something was very, very wrong on the 4th floor of the Ravenswood Manor. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in frustration. The first plumber, a burly, no-nonsense man named Frank, spent an hour scanning the walls with a thermal camera and moisture meters. He found nothing. No leaking pipes, no damp insulation. "Lady, I don't know what to tell you," he said, wiping his forehead with a rag. "There's no water source here. That gunk ain't from any pipe I've ever seen. Smells like a funeral home got mixed up with a candy factory." He left, confused and slightly uneasy, refusing payment. The second contractor, a building restoration specialist, took one look at the black fluid, now steadily weeping from 2 more cracks in the baseboard, and shook his head. "That's not mold. That's not rot. I've never seen anything like it. It's almost organic, but not." He took a sample in a sterile jar, promising to have it analyzed, but the look in his eyes told Sarah he wasn't optimistic. The smell was now a permanent fixture, and the complaints were escalating. Residents were talking about headaches, strange dreams, and a general feeling of unease. The building's pristine reputation, the very thing Sarah was paid to uphold, was beginning to rot from the inside out. Her phone rang constantly. She was in her ground floor office, staring at the digital blueprints for the 100th time, when Ben from the front desk appeared in her doorway, his face pale. "Ms. Gable, you need to see the security footage from the 4th floor hallway. From last night." His voice was a nervous whisper. Her stomach tightened into a knot. "What is it, Ben?" It's easier if you just look." He led her to the security monitor in the back office and pulled up the footage from camera 4. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. The hallway was empty, illuminated by the dim night lighting. For several minutes, nothing moved. Then, it started. The black fluid began to seep from the original crack in the baseboard. But on camera, it was different. It wasn't a passive leak. It flowed with a purpose, a slow, deliberate tide of darkness that crept across the Persian runner. As it moved, it didn't soak into the fabric. Instead, it seemed to coil and writhe on the surface, forming those same intricate, spiraling patterns she thought she had imagined. It was like watching a living Rorschach test, a sentient ink blot spreading across the floor. Then, the most chilling part. The fluid reached the door of apartment 4A. It didn't pool there. It began to climb. Thin, tendril-like streams of the black substance slithered up the polished wood of the door, like vines growing in fast forward, before retracting back into the main puddle on the floor a few moments later. Then, it receded, flowing back into the crack from which it came, leaving the hallway floor perfectly clean and dry. As if nothing had happened at all. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Her professional composure cracked. This was beyond contractors and plumbers. This was impossible. Her mind, screaming for a rational anchor, latched onto the one constant in this madness, apartment 4B. The one place the fluid had not touched on the footage. The one place that was off-limits. The tenant, Mr. Lemarchand, was the key. He had to know what was happening. He might even be the cause. The standing order to never enter the unit now felt less like an eccentric request and more like a warning. But with the building's integrity and the residents' well-being at stake, her duty to investigate overrode a 2-decade-old note. She made a decision. Her hands were trembling as she took the heavy master key ring from its locked drawer. The key for 4B was the oldest and largest, a skeleton key of tarnished brass. She didn't tell Ben what she was going to do. She just walked back to the elevator, her heart hammering against her ribs. The ride to the 4th floor felt longer than ever. The hallway was silent, the smell a palpable presence. She stood before the door of 4B, the cold emanating from it as always. This was a violation of policy, of privacy, of a direct request. But the image of that black, living fluid climbing a tenant's door was burned into her mind. She inserted the master key into the ancient lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled click that was profoundly unsettling. She took a deep breath, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped into the darkness of apartment 4B. The first thing that assaulted her was the smell. It was the same sweet sickly odor from the hallway, but here it was pure, concentrated, and ancient. It was the source. The second thing was the geometry. The apartment was wrong. From the outside, 4B was a corner unit, should have been a large, rectangular space with windows overlooking the city. But the room she entered was neither rectangular nor did it have any visible windows. It was a vast, shadowy antechamber that seemed to stretch back far further than the building's physical dimensions should allow. The walls were not drywall and plaster, they were made of a dark, rough-hewn stone, slick with the same black fluid that was seeping into the hallway. The floor was uneven stone, and the air was cold and damp, the hum of the city completely absent. It wasn't an apartment. It was a cavern. A nest. And in the center of the room, surrounded by a latticework of the dried, crystalline black substance, was a shape. It was large, pulsating softly, and utterly alien. It resembled a gigantic, exposed heart made of obsidian and solidified tar, veined with phosphorescent green. It had no eyes, no face, no limbs, but she could feel a profound, ancient awareness radiating from it. This was the Tenant. This was Mr. Arthur P. Le Marchand. And she had just woken it up. Time froze. Sarah's mind, trained to handle leaking pipes and noisy neighbors, short-circuited. The rational world she had built her life upon shattered into a million pieces. The thing in the center of the room did not move, but the air around it shimmered, and a low, subaudible hum vibrated through the stone floor and up into the bones of her feet. The sweet sickly smell was so potent here it was a taste, coating her tongue and the back of her throat. This was not a creature, not in any sense she understood. It was a presence. A geological fact. It had been here, sleeping, for a very, very long time. And her intrusion was a pinprick of light in its eternal darkness. She took a stumbling step back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The movement, small as it was, seemed to register. The pulsating rhythm of the core quickened. The phosphorescent veins flared with a sickly green light, and from the latticework of dried black material around it, a fresh, viscous droplet of the substance welled up and dripped onto the stone floor. It did not splash. It moved. Like a single, sentient bead of mercury, it began to slide toward her. That broke her paralysis. Sarah turned and ran, her professional heels slipping on the damp stone. She burst back out into the fourth-floor hallway, the sudden normalcy of the Persian runner and the walnut wainscoting feeling like a cruel joke. She slammed the heavy oak door shut, the click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the silent hall. She leaned against the door, gasping, her entire body trembling. She expected to hear a thunderous pounding from the other side, the splintering of wood. But there was nothing. Only silence. And then, the smell intensified. The sweet rot became overwhelming, and the black fluid began to seep from the cracks around the doorframe of 4B, not as a slow leak, but as a weeping wound. It flowed faster now, with purpose, snaking along the baseboards with that same eerie, deliberate motion she had seen on the security footage. It was responding. It was awake. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers numb with terror. She had to call the police. The CDC. Someone. Anyone. But what would she say? "Hello, there's a giant heart made of tar in my apartment building, and it's leaking sentient sludge." They would hang up. She'd be committed. The fluid reached the opposite wall and began to climb, just as it had on the camera. This time, it didn't retract. It spread, like a fast-growing fungus, darkening the wallpaper, dripping from the ceiling. The hallway lights flickered. A high-pitched, frantic buzzing started from the emergency light above her. She had to get people out. Now. She ran down the hall, abandoning any pretense of calm, and started pounding on doors. "Fire alarm," she screamed, her voice raw. "Everyone out. Now. Evacuate." Doors cracked open, revealing faces etched with confusion and fear. The residents smelled the odor, saw the genuine terror on their unflappable property manager's face, and some began to move. But as they stepped into the hallway, they saw the spreading blackness. Mrs. Gable from 4A shrieked, pointing at the fluid now dripping from her own doorframe. Panic began to spread, faster than the entity itself. Sarah directed them to the stairwell, her mind racing. The fluid was coming from 4B. It was the source. It was trying to expand, to feed. On what? The fear in the air was now as tangible as the smell. The lights flickered again, and this time, they went out completely, plunging the fourth floor into near-total darkness, broken only by the faint, ghastly green emergency lights. In the strobing gloom, the black fluid seemed to glow with an inner darkness. It wasn't just spreading randomly anymore. It was beginning to take shape. A long, thin limb, like an arm made of crude oil, pushed itself out from the main pool near 4B's door, feeling its way along the wall. A second one followed. They were clumsy, experimental, but undeniably purposeful. The entity wasn't just leaking, it was building itself bodies from its own substance. It was reaching out. Sarah backed away toward the stairwell door, her breath catching in her throat. One of the oil-black limbs brushed against the ankle of Mr. Peterson from 4C, who had been frozen in fear. He didn't scream. He made a small, gurgling sound as the limb seemed to latch onto him. The blackness flowed up his leg, not burning, but absorbing. It enveloped him in a matter of seconds, and when it receded, slithering back into the main mass, Mr. Peterson was left standing there. His eyes were open, but they were vacant. A small, serene smile was on his face, utterly incongruous with the terror of the situation. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his movements unnaturally smooth. He was no longer Mr. Peterson. He was a puppet. A conduit. The entity had made its first catch. And it was hungry for more. Sarah slammed the fire door to the stairwell shut, leaning her full weight against it. She could hear the muffled screams and the wet, slithering sounds from the other side. The building's fire alarm finally blared to life, a deafening, clanging bell that was both a relief and a new layer of nightmare. She had to get to the security office. She had to see the big picture. Taking the stairs two at a time, she burst into the lobby. It was chaos. Residents from the lower floors were streaming out the main doors, confused and panicked. Ben was trying to maintain order, his face a mask of pure terror. Ben. The security monitors. Now, she yelled over the alarm. They ran to the back office. Sarah's blood ran cold. On the bank of monitors, she could see the entity's progression. It was no longer confined to the fourth floor. The black fluid was pouring down the stairwells, oozing down elevator shafts, spreading through the building's internal skeleton like a cancer. On the camera for the third-floor hallway, she saw two more of the oil-black constructs, now more defined, almost humanoid but horrifically wrong in their proportions, herding a small group of terrified residents. They weren't killing them. They were touching them, and with each touch, the person would go still, their eyes glazing over, before joining the ranks of the serene-faced puppets. The entity wasn't destroying, it was assimilating. It was building a colony. Her eyes darted to the monitor for the main power room in the basement. The fluid was there too, coating the electrical panels. The building was being cut off from the inside. They had minutes, maybe less, before they were trapped in here with it. She saw the feed from her own office. One of the humanoid shapes was standing behind her desk, its head tilted, looking at her family photo. It reached out a dripping, black finger and touched the glass. The thought of that thing touching her life, her memories, filled her with a rage so pure it burned away the last of her fear. This was her building. These were her people. She had let this thing out, and she had to put it back. It wasn't about killing it. She knew, with a cold, certain dread, that it couldn't be killed. It was about containment. The blueprints. She remembered the original blueprints. The Ravenswood Manor was old, but it had been retrofitted with a Halon fire suppression system decades ago, a last resort measure that flooded sensitive areas with inert gas to snuff out fires by removing oxygen. It had never been used. It was their only shot. Ben, the master override for the Halon system. Where is it? He stared at her, blank. The what? It's in the engineering control room, but Ms. Gable, that will suffocate everyone left inside. There's no one left to save on those floors, Ben. They're already gone. It's them or the whole city. She sprinted to the engineering room, a small, locked closet behind the laundry. She used her master key, her hands shaking. Inside was a single, red panel with a large, clear cover over a switch. A warning label screamed about oxygen deprivation and immediate evacuation. She could hear the slithering, scraping sounds coming down the hallway toward her. She didn't look back. She took a deep breath, smashed the glass with her elbow, and pulled the switch. A deep, thrumming hum filled the building, and a hissing sound echoed from the ventilation shafts. On the security monitor, she saw the effect. On the 4th floor, the humanoid shapes of black fluid began to writhe and slow, their forms becoming less distinct. The main mass seeping from 4B recoiled, pulling back toward its source. The halon gas wasn't harming it, but it was disrupting its cohesion, its ability to maintain its forms and spread. It was an irritant. A deterrent. It was buying them time. She ran back to the lobby. Ben, get everyone out. Now. And call 911. Tell them it's a massive chemical leak. A quarantine situation. Do not let anyone back in. She watched the last of the confused residents flee into the Chicago night. Then she turned back to the stairwell. She couldn't leave it like this. The gas would eventually dissipate, and the entity would resume its spread. It knew her now. It had tasted the fear of the building. It would not go back to sleep. She had to seal it. Using a master key from the maintenance locker, she accessed a secure utility elevator that went directly to the basement power grid. She shut down everything: power, water, gas. She was plunging the Ravenswood Manor into a dark, silent tomb. Then, she went to the building's main structural shutoffs. With a series of heavy, manual levers, she engaged the emergency fire seals, massive, reinforced steel barriers that dropped down at key points in the stairwells and hallways, segmenting the building. The sound of crashing metal echoed through the hollowed-out structure like a funeral dirge. She was sealing the entity, and herself, inside the upper floors. She took the service elevator one last time, up to the 3rd floor. The steel seal had already cut her off from the lobby. The halon hissing had stopped. The silence was absolute and profound. The air was thin, cold, and still carried that faint, sweet smell. The black fluid was gone from this floor, retreated back to its source. She walked to the sealed stairwell that led to the 4th floor and sat on the bottom step, her back against the cold steel. She was the custodian now. Not of a building, but of a threshold. Her phone had no signal. She was alone in the dark. But she was in control. Weeks later, a specialized, silent team, men and women in unmarked hazmat suits, would access the building. They would find Sarah Gable alive, though terribly thin, living in a fortified section of the 3rd floor. They would restock her supplies, food, water, batteries for her lanterns. They would not speak to her. They were not there to rescue her. They were there to maintain the quarantine. They were there because she had filed her final, encrypted report from the building's secure internal server before she shut it down. The report that contained the security footage, her testimony, and her recommendation: permanent, armed containment. The entity in 4B was classified. The Ravenswood Manor was officially condemned due to a catastrophic, unspecified structural and environmental failure. The story made the news for a week. But in the city that never sleeps, it was soon forgotten. And in the silent, dark heart of the building, Sarah Gable remains. She monitors the sensors she had the cleanup crew install. She listens for any sound from the floor above. She is the guardian at the gate. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she presses her ear against the cold steel of the fire seal and hears it, a slow, rhythmic, pulsating thrum. A heartbeat made of stone and tar, waiting patiently in the dark. It is not asleep. It is listening back. And it is always, always hungry.